Hi, True Avatars! Welcome to the 19th episode of your Queer Video Game Podcast. I am your host, Zoe Wild. I am a transgender and bisexual woman, and my pronouns are she, her. Once again, this week I'm all by myself for the first half of this episode. I'll be discussing what I've been playing, and watching too, actually, along with the news. This week's news is really just one major story, and then one smaller story. It was, thankfully, in my opinion, a much slower week. But as we move into February and March, we'll be seeing a lot more news as this year's release schedule begins to take shape, especially on the Nintendo side of things. I think there's rumors of a Direct in the next few weeks, but even then, if there isn't, we still know that there's the April 2nd Direct that's going to detail the Switch 2, and then we'll know Nintendo's plans for the year. But anyway, in the second half of this episode, for this week's segment, I'm once again joined by one of my oldest and gayest friends, Graeme. Graeme was actually one of my first guests all the way back in episode 2, and I highly recommend going back to check that episode out. But when Graeme is on later in the episode, we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, I think, that is probably relatable to most queer video gamers. And that's the question of, did any video games help you explore your sexuality before you came out? Or furthermore, did they help you come out of the closet? So later in the episode, like I said, Graeme will be on to help discuss that with me. But in the meantime, let's talk about what I've been playing. So I've been playing more Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. Admittedly, I haven't gotten too much farther than when we last talked. I mean, in my opinion, I got much farther than when we last spoke. But technically speaking, I didn't get that much farther. I feel like I only got maybe 2 hours further in playtime. But when we last spoke, I had just had the Yoshi join my party. And now I've gotten to the end of that chapter where Yoshi joins. And I have obtained the 3rd Crystal Star. I won't really detail what happens. Just that I did, towards the end of that chapter, see Vivian one more time. She's the trans character, and I'm very excited I feel like chapter 4 has got to be the chapter where she joins the party. I'm hopeful for that. So maybe that next week I can be talking to you about how Vivian joined my party. And there's 2 trans women on the party now. But in the meantime, I've also been watching The Last of Us Season 1. And the first time, so here in Canada, we don't have HBO. I'll just say that. We don't have HBO. We have something called Crave. Which is basically Canada's version of HBO. So it's run by Bell, which is our big, horrible phone company, which is more or less a monopoly. But anyway, so they run this service called Crave, which has a bunch of Canadian content too, but it mostly is home to HBO and Warner Brothers content. So when I first watched The Last of Us, I was actually recovering from my bottom surgery, so I didn't have time to just binge it. And also, I couldn't entirely focus on it because I was so busy and focused on recovery that I was kind of at the back of my mind whenever I was watching. That was my surgery recovery was on my mind. But while I was watching, I did enjoy the show. I really loved it. This first season was amazing. It was as good, if not better, than the games. But the other thing, and the really key thing here too, is I'm not saying the bottom surgery is. I'm trying to undersell that. But when I was watching the show on Crave, I feel like I don't know what resolution Crave is. It's definitely not 1080p. I'll say that much. I think at best it's a very muddy 720p. It looks horrible to watch any show on there in quote unquote HD. You're not getting 4K resolution, that's for sure. So when I watched it, like, it looked fine. It was a good show, looked fine. The episodes were all well written. Really no complaints about the show, but the presentation on Crave made it look complete trash, like garbage. Muddy, low resolution, compression, I forget what they call it, blocking, macro blocking, I think is what they call it, where it's like looks kind of blocky and pixelated in places because they can't basically stream every little detail. So I think about I want to say a year ago now, whenever Last of Us Season 1 came out on 4K, I did pick up the 4K release. So we have a 4K TV, we have a 4K Blu-ray player, and I'm a bit of a film snob, especially when it comes to quality. So I like to have stuff on nice 4K quality discs when I can, of course. So of course I had to have The Last of Us. I have like a Naughty Dog shelf, actually. Maybe I'll post a picture of it at some point. But I have like the Uncharted movie, The Last of Us series, and then also all the games from those series for PS4 and PS5. So my partner and I decided, well, Last of Us Season 2 is coming out. We were talking about the inevitable apocalypse that's coming to the planet. We were deciding, do we want Nazis or zombies to take over the world? And we decided zombies for sure, but the cordyceps scare us. And The Last of Us is so well done. But anyway, I'm getting carried away here. We decided to watch Season 1 again. And we're only about a bit of the way into Episode 3, which is the tearjerker episode. But even just the first episode, watching it, like, it's visually gorgeous. And part of it too was like I don't remember it looking this good on Crave because obviously it didn't. So like just like the crispiness of the picture, like it looks so clean and clear, like you're looking into a window into the show. But in general, the show just looks so good. Like there's a scene where Tess, Joel, and Ellie are walking into, I think it's a museum in Boston, and there's like my partner just stopped and she said, like, art department must have had a field day with this because you see all the cordyceps, the rotting cordyceps all over the building. And like there's just so much of it that it must have been a lot of work, and it looks like there was a lot of attention to detail. It looks so visually stunning. So not only does the picture look so much better on a 4K disc, like worlds better, but also just like in general, the show looks so good too. So props to the team that worked on that show because it looks so good, and I'm really excited for season 2, which I think is supposed to be coming in April. There's not a lot of episodes of season 1, but I do like how in season 1 they kind of show you a little bit more about how the cordyceps took over, which we don't really get to see in the game. The game kind of glosses over most things, and we also don't get to see the Bill and Frank storyline much either in the games. So I do like that the show expands on that. And then, of course, I feel like the final episode, even though really well done and faithful to the game, was also cut a bit short. I think it's the shortest episode in the season, and it's just very short. It's just the last section of the game. So I hope they expand on season 2 a lot more, because if they're taking the second game, which is longer than the first game, admittedly, but also if they're going to split it into 2 seasons or more, then they can really expand on each part of the story in that game. And they can even show us stuff that happened in between the 2 games. Because I think in the games, at least, there's a 5-year time skip. I don't know what they're going to do for season 2, because the 5-year time skip also happened in real life between the 2 games, so it made some sense. But it's only 2 years later that we're seeing season 2. So I'm not sure what their plan is, but we do know it is based on the second game. So they are showing all that stuff. So I'm curious what they're going to do with it. I'm curious how they're going to handle all the twists and turns. I'm curious where they're going to consider the midpoint for the game to do season 3. Again, I have a feeling where they're going to do all this stuff. I have a feeling how the first episode is going to go. But if they really wanted to drag out that first twist, they could definitely have that first twist happen at the end of episode 2 or episode 3 to really show us where Ellie and Joel have been and what they've been up to in the years since the first story, the first season of the first game, what have you. So anyway, yeah, I'm just really excited to watch more of season 1. I'm really excited to see season 2. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to watch it on Muddy Crave, but hopefully they do another 4K release. Although, to be honest, I am with the tariffs they just announced here in Canada for the US, or in the US for Canada. I don't know how much I'm going to be supporting American-made discs. I know the discs themselves are manufactured in Mexico. I'm not boycotting Mexico, but boycotting the US, which is a US production. But again, Last of Us is another gray area. The discs are produced in Mexico. I think everything's packaged and sent up from Mexico. And the show was produced in Canada, so it's got a lot of Canadian money. It funded a lot of Canadian jobs, but then ultimately all the money that the Blu-ray is going to make is going to go straight back to HBO, which is an American company. And then there's like arguments like, okay, but it's coming from California, and California is a blue state, and you know, what the U.S. government really wants to do is bleed out the blue states and make them come over to the red side, you know, of things. So it's a lot of gray areas. I feel like I've convinced myself to actually buy season 2 on 4K. I might not be able to resist, but there are a lot of questions up in the air politically right now. And I'm just like wondering, you know what, like I just got charged for the next month of Netflix, but Netflix is getting canceled for sure. And I will not lie, I do really want to see the end of Cobra Kai season 6. So once I've seen that, I'll probably cancel Netflix. On this podcast, I don't condone piracy, but definitely put your money and your votes and your attention where it should go. And also stay safe, of course. You got to make the decisions for yourself, what's financially safe for you, what's socially safe for you. So anyway, I'm getting completely in the weeds on Last of Us Season 1. Season 1 is great. If you haven't watched it yet, I seriously recommend. If you can stomach the horror and the creepiness of it all, definitely go check it out. It's also a very, very queer show. There's an entire episode that really focuses on Ellie's queer relationship, and I like that it actually occurs in the storyline where it should in the game. I'm surprised when they remastered or when they remade The Last of Us Part 1 for PS5, they didn't put that Left Behind DLC, which takes place halfway through the game. They still have you play it at the end. I thought they were just going to build it into the story where once you get to that section of the game, it takes the detour, you play the DLC, and then you go back to the main game. I really wish they'd have done that because the show does that. I don't think it hurts or I mean, I don't think it hurts or benefits things one way or the other for the most part, but I do think the benefit of having everything in chronological order is a little bit nicer. So I wish they'd done that in the game, but the show does keep everything chronological. So, and there's only 9 episodes. Some of them are feature length. Like I think the first episode is 80 minutes. So like be ready to sit down, grab some snacks, however you enjoy watching your TV, just like get settled in and enjoy the show because it's so good. And for the last game that I've been playing, it's not a queer game in any stretch of the imagination, but it's a game I like to play. It's Hot Wheels Unleashed 2. I'm a sucker for racing games. I'm a sucker for arcade racing games, and I'm a sucker for Hot Wheels games. Always have since I was a kid. Me and my little brother, we played a lot of Hot Wheels games, going back to the one for PC. I think it was called Stunt Track Challenge, or maybe Stunt Track Challenge 2, something like that. It had definitely had Stunt Track in the name, but there were a bunch of Stunt Track Racing, Stunt Track Challenge. Anyway, in that game, like you're racing as like little Hot Wheels cars around the house, and in one of them you're in the backyard, and at the end you like to win the race you have to dive into a sandbox. Like that's the end of the race. It's like your car falls into a sandbox and you crash. And so these Hot Wheels Unleashed games really bring out that what made those games back in the late 90s, early 2000s great, because there were a lot of Hot Wheels games later on and that were just as good that I enjoyed. I enjoyed Velocity X, I enjoyed Mechanics, and I enjoyed World Race, and Beat That I think I also played. I'm getting in the weeds on Hot Wheels games, and I'm so sorry, listeners, but I'm just such a nostalgic, bit of a slut for Hot Wheels games. But anyway, those games all had like quote unquote life-size cars, which is cool. It had that concept has its place for sure, but there are very few games where you're like a little toy car. So it's really cool that Hot Wheels Unleashed 2 does that, but also it's made by a company known for racing games, so Milestone. They're an Italian company that makes basically makes racing games, and they've done such a slick job with these Hot Wheels Unleashed games. I recommend checking them out. I think Hot Wheels Unleashed 2 has got to be coming for free to some platforms at some point, if it's not already on Game Pass, if it's not already, I think Hot Wheels Unleashed 1 was given out as part of PS Plus, so I think the second game will definitely be coming at some point. It would surprise me if not, because the online is kind of dying at the moment. I feel like the second game didn't sell as well as the first, and now Milestone doesn't have the license to make a third game anyway, so they're working on a different game, which is a reboot of a racing game from the 90s called Screamer. So I think spiritually, from a mechanical perspective of like how racing feels, it'll probably be an evolution of Hot Wheels Unleashed of the series, but we're not getting Hot Wheels Unleashed 3, at least not from Milestone. And if it does come from another developer, I don't know that it'll be as slick and buttery as them. But anyway, just to unwind and de-stress, I do like to play some racing games. It doesn't sound like I'm de-stressing, but it's kind of my comfort food. So I'll throw on some music, some like good high energy music, like some rock songs, some pop songs, and I'll do a few races. And it's so easy to get trophies in that game that I think I've popped maybe between 5 and 10 trophies just like over a 2-hour play session, which is kind of fun. I like collecting trophies, especially when they're relatively easy to get. I don't like it when they're too challenging or too monotonous, like you gotta, kill 200 guys or do 200 races. Like I don't really care for trophies like that just feel like time sucks, but I enjoy a good racing game. I enjoy some good trophy hunting. And this game, Hot Wheels Unleashed 2, scratches that itch. So anyway, let's move on to the news. So like I said, there was only one major news story this week, and then there's a smaller one. I'm going to talk about the smaller one at the end because it really is kind of disappointing. Actually, you know what? I'm going to talk about it now because I would rather talk about the bigger one to end on, because they're both kind of really depressing bits of news, in my opinion. So from Video Games Chronicle, a bunch of queer games have received honorable mentions for the Game Developers' Choice Awards. I know, honorable mentions. Great. Okay, like why are you even bringing this up, Zoe? Well, there is one game that got nominated, and I have a bone to pick with this game, again, because it's a game I've always had a bone to pick with since I started this podcast and I played this game. But anyway, so this year is the 25th Annual Game Developers' Choice Awards, and the ceremony will take place on March 19th. Only one queer game got nominated, and it was mostly honorable mentions, like I said, unfortunately. But the game that was nominated, which was nominated for the category Social Impact, I'm sure you can guess where this is going, is Life is Strange Double Exposure. And it's up against, I don't know how to pronounce this game, 1000 Resist, Astrobot, Frostpunk 2, and Neva. So it's not going to win, because every other game on that list has won a lot more, or at least Astrobot and Neva have won a lot more awards at various awards shows and ceremonies over the last few months. So I think Astrobot probably has it in the bag, but if not Astrobot, probably Neva. Now, I don't really know why Astrobot is nominated for Social Impact. If I'm being honest, I don't know what that game has to say about social issues. It's a game about platforming and it's really for escapism, it's great. Like, I love Astrobot. It's one of my games of the year from last year, but I don't know that it needs to be in the social impact category. Especially since like Mario games, like you never see Mario Odyssey in this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to look that up really quick. Give me a second here. I'm going to look to see if Mario Odyssey was ever nominated in this category. Okay, so I'm back, and it doesn't really look like that awards category even existed back then. For a second, it was really hard to find, but then I realized I was being silly, and there was an archive button on the Game Developers Choice Awards website. So I did find out that Mario Odyssey was nominated that year for various categories, but again, there was no social impact. So again, if there's a new 3D Mario game this year, and then I guarantee you I'll be back next year to say, if I remember, that Mario Odyssey 2 or Mario Switch 2, whatever you want to call the new Mario game, which I'm sure is coming this year. If it doesn't, I think Nintendo's making a mistake. But again, I don't think it's going to be nominated for a social impact award. There are tons of other better games that they could have included in that category, even if they weren't going to win, over Astrobot, which is weird to me. Because like Neva, sure. But like, I'm pretty sure Dragon Age the Veilguard was an honorable mention in that category. And it's not nominated. And that seems weird to me that you would put that over Astrobot. I understand Astrobot for popularity's sake, but like, again, what is it doing for social impact? Anyway, so the other honorable mentions, though, and I can't speak anymore, apparently, but the other honorable mentions include Life is Strange Double Exposure for Best Narrative, Dragon Age the Veilguard for Social Impact, as I said, Dragon Age the Veilguard for Best Technology. And the Best Technology category, because I looked this up, is finalists will be recognized for the overall excellence of technical execution in a game, including but not limited to graphics programming, artificial intelligence, networking, and physics. So I'm going to be honest, it's a little depressing that this is the best we get, given that there are many queer developers in the industry and a lot more queer games that could be in this category, if we're just including queer games. But also, my thoughts on Life is Strange Double Exposure, again, yeah, it has really great queer inclusion, and that's where all the benefits, all the good things about this game end for me. It's not a good game in any way. The narrative, aside from the queerness, is awful. The gameplay is significantly worse. The choices are weirder and less impactful. I was really disappointed with Life is Strange Double Exposure. It does not... I know a lot of people had issues with True Colors, and I know even more people had issues with Before the Storm. I think Double Exposure makes Before the Storm look like Life is Strange 1. And I might have said that before. It might be a hot take. I don't know. I don't remember everything I've said in this podcast, unfortunately. But I do think that Double Exposure is the weakest in the series. I haven't even played Life is Strange 2, but I know a lot of people speak of it very fondly. But if you go on, for example, the Life is Strange subreddit, you'll see a lot of complaints about Double Exposure, which is too bad. I really wish it had been a better game, and then all that queerness would have not been for nothing, because I don't know that this game is going to get itself a sequel. I don't know if we're ever going to see a Life is Strange 5, I guess, would be the number. Again, I hope that's not true. I hope there is another Life is Strange game. I hope the development issues that plagued the first one and the inclusion issues that plagued the dev team before are not carried forward to a potential Life is Strange 5. I hope it does well. I hope it's got even more queer characters in it, but we'll see. I haven't looked up sales for the game, and in the interest of not derailing this podcast, I'm not going to. I don't really want to talk about sales figures on the podcast, because I could, and I would talk about them for hours and what they mean. But this podcast is about queer video games. And anyway, I want to talk about this other news story. So there was this week a major shakeup at Bioware. And I'm sure some people saw this coming because Dragon Age the Veilguard, and as I mentioned last week, Dragon Age the Veilguard did not sell super well. And I think they were already starting to let a couple team members go the weeks before. But again, I'm just going to iterate that this is an evolving story. I'm sure we haven't heard the last of it, but it seemed like every day this week there was a new development as various sources and outlets came forward with some new updates about what's happening at Bioware. So I think the best way to address this is to just recap everything in chronological order, because it was quite the series of unfortunate events, so to say. So the first story is that Bioware announced via their blog that the team making Mass Effect 5 is being shrunk down and more focused, while other devs are being sent elsewhere at EA. So I'm going to quote their blog here, and this is only select quotes, not the whole blog post, but now that Dragon Age the Veilguard has been released, a core team at Bioware is developing the next Mass Effect game under the leadership of veterans from the original trilogy, including Mike Gamble, Preston Watamaniuk, Derek Watts, I'm sorry for butchering these names, Parrish Lay, and others. Given this stage of development, we don't require support from the full studio. We have incredible talent here at Bioware, and so we have worked diligently over the past few months to match many of our colleagues with other teams at EA that had open roles that were a strong fit. So when I first heard this news, it didn't sound good that Bioware was getting smaller, but it felt potentially reassuring that they were at least making sure staff wasn't being laid off. I'm making the best of a bad scenario type deal. But like I said, I'm going to get into this, and you're going to see that this is actually not good. So, not long after, Rebecca Valentine at IGN broke the story that some roles are being terminated, but not a lot. Quote, IGN understands that EA has already placed an unknown number of developers from Bioware into other equivalent roles within the company. A smaller number of Dragon Age team members are also seeing their roles terminated and are being offered time to apply to other roles within the company if they so choose. Unquote. So again, some layoffs, but only that they're being given a chance to apply to jobs within the company. So this left a really bad taste in my mouth, as you can imagine, if it didn't leave a bad taste in yours as well, because if these team members are already qualified and EA knows that they're qualified to do the jobs they're applying for, and those jobs are available in the company, why not move as many people as you can into those roles? And sure, there's an argument to be made that, like, okay, we have 2 programmers and 1 programming job, so they can both apply for it. But there must be some seniority or skill level or honor system that they have in place already to promote people. You know, oh, well, programmer A has worked here 2 months longer than programmer B. We're going to give the job to programmer A. And then we're going to give programmer B resources to find another job at a different company entirely. But instead, they're like given given the chance to apply also doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to get the job if they apply. They're probably, if I had to guess, competing against outside, like external developers who are applying to get into the company. So it just really bad taste in my mouth. And I know there's intricacies to this, but I just don't care. This is really not good, especially since we already know they've lied in their blog post, right? So part 3 of this saga is that a Reddit user on our gaming leaks and rumors, and I know not everything there should be trusted, but this was really well sourced, and I'm going to link in the show notes. You'll have a link to this post, which has its own links and sources, because this comes from a variety of places that this person found. So anyway, this user found that several team members were actually laid off, including some writers. So, quote, according to posts shared on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, Bioware's restructuring has led to the termination of Dragon Age: The Veilguard's lead writer, Trick Weeks, lead editor Karen West Weeks, and narrative editor Ryan Cormier. Additionally, Bioware producer Jennifer Chevry-Cott, associate game producer Daniel Steed, senior product manager Lena Anderson, and senior systems designer Michelle Flam were also let go, while senior writer Cheryl Chi, who wrote Dragon Age's Liliana, Isabella, Blackwell, and Harding, was moved to EA Motive. Bioware and EA haven't confirmed the fact, only that the company is on a, quote, restructuring, unquote, and then unquote the whole thing. So that was all from the post. I'll also remind listeners at this point that all that EA and Bioware have said is that in the first blog, where they're downsizing while moving the staff to other roles at EA, they haven't confirmed any layoffs from any level in the company, despite a bunch of layoffs confirmed and no mention of being offered another job at EA from many of these people. So, this is part 4 of the saga, and this is where the saga currently lands as of the weekend. I'm recording on February 1st, but on Friday, January 31st, Bloomberg revealed that over half of Bioware's staff has been cut in the last 2 years, from 200 to less than 100 people. So, Bioware sources told Bloomberg that the studio has been downgraded to under 100 people. And again, I'm quoting the article here, but at least they got to keep their jobs. During the same reorganization this week, around 24 other people at Bioware were laid off, according to the People Familiar, who asked not to be identified discussing non-public information. Writer Trick Weeks and producer Jen Chevry said on Blue Sky that they were among the veteran workers who'd been cut. Bioware is now down from more than 200 people 2 years ago to less than 100 today. According to the People Familiar, a small team will remain to work on the next Mass Effect game, led by company veterans who oversaw the development on the original trilogy as well as on 2019's Anthem, in hopes of expanding as the game gets further into production. The company announced the reorganization on Wednesday, saying it planned to become a, quote, a more agile focused studio, unquote, without mentioning the job cuts and the relocation of staff permanently to other studios. A spokesperson for EA declined to comment on specific numbers. Dragon Age: The Veilguard was undeniably divisive, but to many who worked on it, it was a miraculous accomplishment to even ship a game after EA forced live service into it, then reversed course. Now, their reward for the long hours and hard work is layoffs and transfers, unquote the whole article. So, This is pretty damning, going from a studio the size of 200 to less than 100 people in that quick a time period, especially after shipping a huge, like a large, massive AAA game and moving right into development on another game of similar size and scope. Something sounds really wrong. I'm not sure I believe that Bioware simply needs a smaller team at the moment for Mass Effect 5. Moving people elsewhere at EA would mean that these people could return when Bioware is ready to move into full development on Mass Effect 5, but laying all of those people off means they're not simply going to be moved back to Bioware or even rehired later. So, my personal feeling is that the next Mass Effect is in trouble, and maybe even Bioware itself could be gone in a few years. And I know that's kind of an extreme jump from this, but going from 200 to 100 people, and now that they're lying about the layoffs, it rubs me the wrong way. And I don't even know if they're going to end up shipping Mass Effect 5. I don't know how long Dragon Age the Veilguard took, but I think it took probably at least 5 years. I'm guessing, I'm not looking that up, I can't be bothered. The point is, games take a really long time to make. We don't even know how long the next game will take to make, because games keep bloating, as we know, and expanding their development scopes and taking a lot more time and a lot more people, and if they don't have enough people to ship this game, they're potentially either going to ship a much smaller game, a much worse game, or take a lot longer to make it. And will the company survive that long to make this big game? And are they, like they say, they're potentially planning to hire more people as time goes on, as the game gets harder, or not harder to develop, but as they get further into development, they might hire more people. But it's really a shame to see a studio that puts out quality queer content do what they're doing to their staff. And it'll be even worse to potentially see a creator of queer inclusive content disappear entirely. So I'm not rooting for Bioware to close. I want to make that clear. I don't want them to close. It's just the writing on the wall seems to be not very good. I'm just saying I would not be surprised if they were gone. But EA doesn't already have the best track record with keeping studios open. The EAs, the Ubisofts of the world, they have this problem where they keep buying up studios and then closing them. So I just have a bad feeling about Bioware. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully they can come back stronger than ever, rehire everyone, never have layoffs again. But like we've already had so many layoffs this year. In fact, there were other layoff stories I was gonna discuss, and then this story kept ballooning, and I just really didn't want to just dump all my news being layoffs, because we know they're happening. They keep happening. And I think, given the state of the world, it's going to keep getting worse. Especially as people, cost of living is getting worse too. So are people really going to spend a ton of money on video games? There's already discussion that the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to cost a lot of money. $400 is one thing. Are the tariffs going to change that? Who knows? And then, of course, there's exchange rates. So if it's $400 in the US, like here in Canada, it's going to be an almost $600 console. And I don't know that I want to shell out for a $600 console, especially a handheld where, 20 years ago, and I know it was 20 years ago, that's a long time for inflation, but I don't think I spent more than a couple $100s on a Game Boy or a DS. So I just triple the price of a handheld console. And I know, again, it's a handheld, but it's also a home console, and I'm getting in the weeds here with this. But if cost of living is high, people are going to spend less money on games. So how many of these games are going to actually make it to release? How many of these games are going to do well on release? Especially too, if Dragon Age the Veilguard wasn't similar enough to its predecessors, who's to say that Mass Effect 5 won't be different? We already saw Mass Effect Andromeda go through a major change, and it wasn't similar enough to the original trilogy that people didn't like it. So unless Mass Effect 5 is a return to form, and Bioware makes their games in general a return to what people loved about Bioware almost 20 years ago now, I don't know. They're not set up for success is all that I'm saying. So I'm hoping for the best, but I'm preparing for the worst. I'm going to get off my soapbox now. That's all the news I have for this week, thankfully. Not too much in the way of good news, unfortunately. Hi, so this is Future Zoe popping in here for a second. So sorry to do this, but I actually forgot a news story when I recorded yesterday. So I recorded yesterday on February 1st. This is February 2nd. I'm just adding this extra little bit of news because I actually had it in my notes and just completely skimmed over it. But Elliot Page is developing a TV series based on Beyond Two Souls. So Elliot Page recently started a production company called Pageboy Productions, which is a great name, by the way, and he's developing a TV adaptation of the Beyond Two Souls video game. Elliot Page originally played Jody, the lead role in this game, well before he transitioned, so it is extremely unlikely he'll be playing that role again, but for anyone who doesn't know, the Steam summary for this game is as follows. A unique psychological action thriller delivered by A-list Hollywood performances by Elliot Page and Willem Dafoe, Beyond Two Souls takes you on a thrilling journey across the globe as you play out the remarkable life of Jody Holmes. Born with a connection to a mysterious entity with incredible powers, Jody is different. Your actions will determine Jody's fate as she faces extraordinary challenges, danger, and heart-wrenching loss on a journey to discover the truth of who she is. Create an action-packed story through your choices and actions as you live her life. A girl born with a link to a supernatural entity called Aiden. By playing as both Jodie and Aiden, you will face spectacular physical and psychological challenges to understand what truly lies beyond. So, from the Variety article, they write, this adaptation will honor the game's legacy while inviting fresh perspectives, Pageboy's head of development and production Matt Jordan Smith said, delving into questions of survival and how split-second decisions can alter not just our lives, but the lives of others are key to telling the story. So, end quote. We don't know much else, but I'm thinking maybe Willem Dafoe could come back for the TV series. I feel like Willem Dafoe is kind of timeless and ageless. Even as he ages, like it's more like a fine wine. When I look at Willem Dafoe now and versus like Spider-Man movies 20 years ago, like I don't see a huge difference. So if they wanted to bring him back, they definitely could. I know for the terrible Death Note adaptation, they brought Willem Dafoe in, and he was an inspiration to that series again 20 years before he actually appeared in it. So I think it's possible they could at least bring Willem Dafoe back, and a small reuniting of Elliot Page and Willem Dafoe could still happen, even if Elliot Page is not starring in the adaptation, or if he is, he's definitely not playing Jodie again. So it is really cool, though. I'll just say this. It's cool to see that Elliot Page has a healthy outlook on his pre-transition projects, something I definitely do not have. So all the power to him. I hope this adaptation turns out well. I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of thoughts about Quantic Dream and David Cage, who made the original game. But this is a trans-led project, so all I can do is hope for the best, really. So anyway, I'm going to let past Zoe take over from here. Hopefully next week I come back with some really good news. I'm hopeful there'll be a direct. Nintendo is kind of known for having directs on during their financial briefings for the end of the year. So hopefully on Tuesday or Wednesday there'll be a direct, and there'll be some good news next week. So at least something exciting to talk about to distract us all from the horrors of the world. But when I get back, I will have Graeme on, and Graeme and I are going to discuss the games that helped us find ourselves, that helped us come out of the closet. So after a brief musical interlude, I will be back with Graeme, so please stay tuned. Hi, True Avatars. I'm back from the break, and joining me is Graeme, all the way from back in episode 2. Graeme is a gay man, pronouns he, him, and he's one of my oldest friends. In fact, we both knew each other long before either of us came out of the closet. Hi, Graeme. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
How are you doing this weekend?
Well, I'm pretty good. Just recovering from the week of work.
That's fair. And the week of politics. I don't know if you've been following any of the politics lately.
I mean, I've tried to not. It filters through anyways onto my Instagram feed and, opening Google and whatever, all the recommended searches. And I'm like, please stop. Stop recommending searches for me, Google. Yeah, so it's as much as I've tried to avoid it, you can't.
My YouTube recommendations is all Nintendo video games and Pokemon cards because that's all I watch on YouTube. I'm pretty basic. But I clicked on one CBC News video about the tariffs thing yesterday, and immediately all those all those recommendations disappeared in my feed, and it was all replaced with like conservative media. It was instantly.
See, my favorite with YouTube is when you're like scrolling through the reels or like the shorts.
Right.
And it just randomly gives you like a Jordan Peterson thing, or the like some kind of conservative argument where it's like, oh, look how dumb these libs are. Like it's like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So I usually try and be like, no, and I try and get past it. Maybe I'll stop long enough to dislike it, and then scroll past, because I'm like, if I let this play out, I know I'm gonna get nothing but that.
Yeah, that's true. And when I joined, I made a Twitter account for True Avatars. And when I did, I wasn't following anyone yet. So all my recommended stuff was straight up like, it was first up at the top of my feed was Elon Musk's Twitter account. But then after that was like all that kind of stuff, like Jordan Peterson, right-wing news, transphobic, homophobic, anti-black, all kinds of anti-woke. It was like all this anti-woke stuff all in my feed immediately. So I had to start following as many game people as I could because I could get that shit out of there.
Immediately you're like, this is not the channel for that. It's really funny when you start any social media, you get all of these like either super generic or super like, again, not your interest recommendations. And you're like, oh, the algorithm has to learn me still. And it's really kind of sad. that their default is hate.
Yeah. And then anyone who doesn't know any better about how the algorithm works and is just joining these platforms is gonna see all these posts and think, oh, this is what people are talking about on this platform, and then going from neutral to being hateful. So, but this podcast is supposed to expel all that crap and just be kind of like a nice, hopeful, optimistic, forget our bullshit worries and everything kind of show. So today I want to talk to you about something fun that we've kind of talked about in the past before, and we've definitely talked about with each other. But I want to talk about which video games helped us explore our sexuality, and in my case, gender, like before you came out of the closet, or stuff that even helped you actually come out of the closet.
I know, super light stuff. Remembering all the games that were instrumental.
Yeah.
Because they are. Stories are important. It's important to have varied stories because that's how we learn about the world. For those of us who aren't privileged enough to be able to travel or, don't have a super wide social network, stories are a good way of getting some of those experiences under our belt, even if not personally experiencing them, hearing about it.
For sure. Yeah. Without stories, like I think the 3 games I'm gonna list out later were like I played them right before, like right as the pandemic hit and right as my brain was starting to percolate with egg cracking. And looking back on it now, I think those 3 games were completely instrumental in figuring out that I was a girl. Like I knew deep down I wanted to be a girl, but I didn't really like. Anyway, these 3 games, I look back and I'm like, oh wow, I played 3 games in quick succession with all female protagonists, all about, well, at least one of them was queer, and it just anyway. They were without those games. I don't know if I would have come out as soon or as quickly or even at all, possibly. They're not completely at. I don't want to say at fault because that sounds negative, but I don't know if they're completely the reason, but they're definitely a big part of the reason. So,
and ultimately, a preface to this whole conversation is that if a video game will never be the one singular cause of that's like I'm pointing at this thing, this is why I come out, this is how I discover who I am, because like it's more multifaceted than that. But as I was saying, the importance of stories and video games as an interactive story that directly engages the player within the narrative, it can feel a lot more active as of an experience than, say, watching a film or reading a book, where you're more of a spectator and you can kind of create that level of separation. But a lot of video games, the protagonist, the player character is the audience implant within the story, so you feel a lot more agency to get involved and you're more invested, and therefore it can teach you a little bit more about yourself because you are going along on this journey alongside these characters.
teaching the game teaching you about yourself is actually a very good way of putting it, because none of these games made us gay, none of these games made us trans. These games helped us discover things. There's nothing in these games that, like, quote unquote, like, I know a lot of people like to use the word indoctrinated. That's
In,
not a that's
incorrectly they will use it, just like never mind.
no, it's a good point, because like I didn't play Life is Strange Before the Storm, see two like a lesbian couple running off into the sunset, escaping on a train, and think like, oh yeah, now I'm lesbian for sure. Like it didn't work that way. It just, I related to it on a level, and it made me question things inside my own head. It didn't indoctrinate me. It didn't. I think I still could have come to these conclusions without the video game, but the video game helped me skip some of those steps in my own brain. But what was already in there was already in there from the day that I was born. And so I don't think there was ever a moment in my life where like trauma happened and then suddenly, like that's just not how being LGBTQ plus works at all. So
no, and it's there are a lot of arguments as to where it comes from, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that it is, and these are ways that we discovered bits and pieces of ourselves that help us piece it together. Would you like to share your first one? I'm so curious what 3 you have.
Oh, do you want me to go first, or do you want to go first?
You should go first.
Okay.
Get the ball rolling.
Well, I'll talk about Life is Strange Before the Storm because it is a game that I've talked about on the show before. In fact, I might even have talked about it when we first were on together in episode 2. But it was a game. It was the first of 3 games I played during the pandemic. Early on, I was still working at the time, but obviously aside from working from home, like I wasn't doing much else. So I would sit there, and I think we would play Rocket League together occasionally. But aside from that, I was playing a lot of single player games, especially my partner would pass out on the couch. So there I was up to like 2 or 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And I think I finished Life is Strange Before the Storm in 2 sittings, because it might have even been 1 sitting, because I was just so enamored with like a life I never experienced, because it's about two teenage girls who are in love, basically. Um, and up until that point, I had watched some lesbian stories, particularly on film, not so much in video games. And I'd played Life is Strange 1, but at the time I didn't, I guess I was so deep in the closet, that game didn't really resonate with me the way Before the Storm did. I think it was like the perfect cocktail of the pandemic and you know, things getting harder for myself and me getting closer to coming out. But then this game came along, and there's specifically this scene where these 2 girls try to run away. They jump into a boxcar, and they try to leave their hometown together. And I think they have their first kiss there. And that was the moment, I think, in the game too, where you realize, oh, okay, they're definitely into each other, like, for sure. Because at that point, I had completely forgotten everything that happened in Life is Strange 1. So I didn't really remember that Chloe was gay, actually. So at that point, I was like, is she gay? Is she not? Like, I don't know. And then these 2 girls share this kiss on this boxcar as they like ride off into the sunset. And then, of course, shit hits the fan shortly after that. But yeah, just seeing these 2 girls kiss, and I was like, I felt a yearning. I know it's been kind of a meme word right now on the internet, but I felt this yearning for like both like admiring them in this story, but also wishing that I could be them, or wishing that I had had that teenage experience, to just be 2 girls in love with like no responsibilities to worry about. And I guess any girls I loved in high school, I guess that could have been something I did experience, but also I wasn't my true self at the time. And I don't really like that expression, true self, but it's just become so kind of, it's just something I hear from cis people a lot. But that was the game where, and it was at that point too, where I was like, it must have been 11 o'clock or midnight at that point, and I was playing that scene. It was in chapter 1 or 2 maybe. And then I think I played the rest of the game, or like a big chunk of the game, into like well into the wee hours of the morning. So yeah, that was one of my first games that helped me discover myself.
And that is wonderful that you can even go back and reflect on one and be like, actually, that was pretty instrumental, even though it wasn't necessarily in the moment. Sometimes things stick with you for a while, and then it comes up at random, inopportune moments, or opportune moments, depending on your perspective. Shout out to David Wood with the whole virus thing of, you know, sometimes an idea will just come back into your head. So
Oh my God, I forgot all about that. For anyone who doesn't know, Graham and I met in English class, and one of our English teachers was called David Wood. That's what he's talking about. He had a lot of wild ideas, and at the time, I remember thinking this guy's too off his rocker. But looking back on it now, he might have been the most sane of us all. So
honestly, again, shout out David Wood.
if Mr. Wood is ever listening to this podcast, you know, Zoe and Graham, he probably has no idea who I am, although I bet he can figure it out just by the context.
Probably.
So how about you? You go for your first game.
So I also, like, when I was reflecting on your question, I was kind of struck with how much of a lack there was of queer specific games that I played when I was younger. I was much more into RPGs, and, you know, specifically JRPGs, which for a long time have been quite notorious about, like, either excluding LGBTQ, making it a little more hidden, and so therefore you have to dig or scratch the surface to get to it, or it isn't there. But that's not to say that these were not instrumental in me discovering things. I think that the first game I'll talk about is Final Fantasy X, one of my all-time favorite games, just because there's such a varied party of different people with different opinions that come together. And that kind of exposed me to just the idea that, you know, you can get along with people who are very different than yourself. And it kind of made me ponder what it's like being queer from a perspective of just feeling othered, feeling different, because obviously the main character, Tigus, however you pronounce that, I say Tigus, and my opinions are objectively correct. So he has no idea what's going on. He's kind of along for the ride, and he's kind of discovering this whole world, meanwhile feeling very separate from it because he's got such a divide from everyone else, not only in a temporal standpoint, but also culturally. He comes from a completely different world. And it's almost like when you grow up in a small town and then you come to a bigger city, you get exposed to a lot of new things. That's what playing the game is like. You're picking things up as you go, and it's very much how I discovered my queerness was like I'm like, oh, I feel very othered from the rest of society. I feel very not the same as everyone else, and I'm aware that my being not the same is not quote unquote for the time I was growing up normal, the time and place in which I was growing up. So it kind of felt good to feel seen in a way that I'm like, I too feel othered. I too feel out of place, but I'm kind of masking well enough that like people accept me, people are okay with me, but I'm not really telling people the truth about myself. You know, just like in the narrative, Titus is advised very early on by Riku. You shouldn't tell people you're from Zanarkand. Zanarkand's a holy place. People wouldn't understand. Like you shouldn't mention that. And to me, like thinking back, I was like, wow, that really is maybe you shouldn't tell people you're gay. Maybe not that I'm blaming Final Fantasy X for putting me in the closet. There are other things I blame for that. Final Fantasy X, just I'm like, huh, that's an interesting metaphor. Just this thing that you're very proud of because Titus is in that moment bragging about I was a star player of the Xanarkand King Abe's and I had this great life back in Xanarkand King, and she just gets very quiet and is like, you shouldn't tell people you're from Xanarkand. People might get upset. People wouldn't understand. So maybe keep that to yourself. I'm fine with it, but not everyone is as cool as I am. And it's like that is such a metaphor.
Yeah, no, it's still very timely too, because we still have people talking that way even in queer circles now, where it's like, you know, maybe don't tell people this one little detail about yourself to keep yourself safe, or in this case it sounds like the kind of person who's like the kind of person who says like I'm okay with it but that other people might not be. It sounds like a little bit of projection where like they're also not okay with it, but they're like, okay, they're forced to look inside themselves to ask that question. But yeah, like I wouldn't necessarily call any of the Final Fantasy games queer games, although Rebirth specifically did have some queer NPCs. So it's a small start, but the fact that you saw that in the game that is not inherently queer, I think is very interesting, because there are a lot of games too where there was no queerness in the games I played, but I took the queerness from them and applied them to my own inner psyche. So,
and one thing I will add in terms of queerness and perception, and perhaps why I now just have an enduring love of villains, is the villains within Final Fantasy and a lot of JRPGs as well as Disney films are very queer coded. Seymour Guado, as one of the primary antagonists of Final Fantasy X, has this kind of strange way of behaving that's very queer, very cold, calculating, which is very much a trope within queer communities for character representation. As the gay character is always very studious and intelligent and bordering like a little psychotic sometimes when it comes to presenting as a villain, and has this very casualness about just how different he is. And he himself is a hybrid of a Guado and a human, so like he is a half-blood, so that also others him within the society. So it's kind of like, of course we make this character a little queer-coded, who is clearly proposing marriage to Yuna, not out of love, not out of romance, strictly to be like, we could rule the world together. Don't you want to be powerful overlords? And she's like, no. And he's like, well, I'm going to have to kill you now. And if that ain't tragically queer, I don't know what the fuck is. But many Final Fantasy villains have a kind of queerness to them, and I'm going to talk more about that later.
I mean, yeah, I obviously I think maybe this will be one of the characters you talk about later, but I definitely see a lot of that in Sephiroth too. So,
I wasn't even thinking about Sephiroth, but yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, the way Sephiroth says like I'm waiting, Cloud, they go the close up on his eyes, and he's like doing this
Just
come hither
kiss,
motion. Yeah,
just
there's
kiss.
he eliminated Zack for a reason. He's like Cloud's all mine now.
Yeah, that's my boyfriend.
Tifa who? So my next game is I'm not going to talk about it a lot because it's not one of those games that I committed to memory a lot. The first game and the last game in my list I think about more often because they're the kinds of games I normally play much more often. But I played a game early in the pandemic called Sea of Solitude, which is about a young woman who's basically fighting a physical manifestation of all her trauma and demons. And again, this is not really a queer game, but playing as a girl in this story where she's dealing with family trauma and issues in her social life and all these feelings of loneliness, which I was feeling at the time, not just because of the pandemic, but loneliness from like any real sense of community with any of my like friends and coworkers and just spaces I existed in. Because I think people can also kind of tell that you're hiding something within yourself, even if they can't put their finger on it. But there's just this otherness that just exists on you, even if like you haven't othered yourself inherently. So pre-transition, like I looking back, I can tell that people knew something was off about me. And now when people say something is off about me too, they can put their finger on it and they hate me for that reason. But beforehand, like I couldn't find community. So that sense of loneliness really resonated with me in Sea of Solitude as this girl basically travels around in this boat in this flooded city and fights like these gigantic physical manifestations of all her problems. And again, that was another game that I finished late one night during the pandemic, I think in one sitting. I stayed up till I want to say 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning again playing this game. And again, it resonated with me. And at the time, I wasn't really sure why. I was like, I really relate to this game, but that doesn't make sense because I'm a man and I shouldn't relate to this because it's a girl. I'm just playing this game because it's like, it's inclusive and interesting and a different perspective. But looking back, it's another game where when I look back on it, I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense why this game resonated with me because it was about a girl dealing with the same issues that I was dealing with my whole life. And maybe if it had been a boy character, it still would have resonated with me to some extent, but it did let me kind of put myself in this position of a girl in that just like, especially too, since beginning my transition, reframing things I enjoy from the perspective of being a woman, it changes a lot of things. It makes me feel more comfortable in things that I used to be mocked for doing, like playing a lot of video games or watching a lot of TV or like taking certain interests. It's like reclaiming them because even before I transitioned, I thought it was really cool when like women would do things that normally men would do, for example. And there's still a stigma of, video games are for men. And there are still a lot of women who when they date men, they find out he plays video games. There are issues there and they don't like it. So I think inherently video games being like kind of this like lonely basement dwelling incel type vibe of players needs to be reclaimed. And I've loved when women would reclaim inherently male things. So I'm getting in the weeds here, but that is to say, all this is to say is that Sea of Solitude, it was another game that really helped me figure out my queerness, at least in hindsight.
And I think that being able to put yourself within the shoes of the protagonist, um, gender becomes irrelevant because there's also plenty of games where the main character does not have a specified gender. I think of Ori and the Blind Forest. Ori has no gender. You can kind of put yourself into their shoes as they're going through this journey, which again has nothing to do with sexuality and gender, but it is kind of a journey of self-discovery. It is a journey of figuring out what happened in this world. Like you're trying to like piece back together. And so but it is really nice to know that a game can so beautifully put yourself in the shoes of others, and also that you have the emotional intelligence and wherewithal to be put in that position, because so many people would play a game and be like, gaming is just entertainment. Okay, yes it is, but are you actually thinking about what you're playing? Clearly this one struck a chord with you that made you think.
Yeah. And these were games too. Life is Strange and Sea of Solitude. Anytime I played, and there were very few games I played pre-transition where I like let myself be emotionally open-minded to these ideas. And Sea of Solitude was specifically one of those games where I don't even know what compelled me to play it. I was just like, I'm going to play this game. It's quote unquote woke. I'm going to see what it's all about. And I think maybe even Ekami recommended it to me. So again, I don't remember what made me play it, but I'm glad I did. So what's your next game?
So I'm sticking on the JRPG train. Dragon Quest VIII is to this day, I think, one of my favorite games. And one thing I really appreciate about it is it displays a kind of healthy male friendship. that is, initially I'm like, what's going on between the hero and this barbarian class type like Yangus? Like this is this like rough talking. He's got this very strong like Cockney British accent. You could definitely imagine him in like a Peaky Blinders, or he's the one who's like the typical British gangster type of voice, and calls you governor, and is clearly obsessed with the hero to the point where they're traveling around together, and with for Yangus it's like where you go I go, and I'm kind of like, this is very strange. I'm wondering what the heck is going on. And it turns out it's like the hero saved Yangus from dying, and so Yangus is like, I owe my life to you, so I'm just following you around. But just their closeness is a very encouraging. Like, I'm like, oh, this is nice. This is nice to just have, like, you're just going on a journey with your buddy, and then you get other party members, and it becomes more of a community. And again, varied people and all the different places you go together and experiences. But the fact that the initial is just this very close friendship, which in any like very close friendship, there is an air of like homoeroticism that kind of enters the picture, and you kind of think about it. But to me, like what I think is beautiful about the writing is that it never really touches on that. Again, this is all something that I just kind of intuit. And later in the Dragon Quest franchise, we get characters like Sylvango in Dragon Quest XI, who is very obviously queer coded and in like a very powerful, like femme presenting, very flamboyant showman of a character. And I'm like, aw, Hero and Yangus were there first, and they walked so Sylvander could fucking run. And also in Dragon Quest XI, you have Eric and the hero, who Eric is very obsessed with the hero in a way that I'm like, Eric's my husband now. Like for my whole like narrative, I'm like, so yeah, we're actually like married, and all of you varied party members are my children. And also I think that Dragon Quest VIII also helped me to discover what type of gay man I wanted to be, because the villain, once again, very, very queer coded. The jester Dual Magus is, first of all, being driven insane by dark magic, but just the way he presents is so very much that villain, very much like Kefka from Final Fantasy VI and Kuya from Final Fantasy IX. Again, we're getting a trend, lots of queer-coded villains. Dual Magus is very gleeful in destruction, and kind of is this like sing-songy, like just reveling in chaos. And again, as much as I love my villains, I was like, there's a queer character that no one seems to like. So I'd prefer to be more supportive and uplifting. So in a way, Dragon Quest VIII kind of encouraged me towards being a good person, or trying to be anyways, within the queer community, and being more like, I'm like, let's be like Hero and Yangus. Let's display something that's not toxic and not trying to destroy the world. The friends we make along the way.
I like that it helped you to not only discover like your queerness, but like the kind of queer person you want to be too. I've never framed it that way. Would you be able to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Absolutely, because I just think that there's a lot of roles that people fit in the world, and specifically within queer communities, there are certain stereotypes, there are certain archetypes, I think is the better word, of personality that people fill, and these are roles people play. And there are some that are very queer people are uniquely filling more, and you have some of them that are very much like the to use a classic like theater term, the rake, people who are like very flirty and very forward about their either sexual advances, romantic advances, etc. So you have these people who are very easily able to garner a kind of intimacy around them, and then you've got people who are very supportive and uplifting and positive, and then you've got people who are very like are all about the read, they're all about the sass, and like analyzing a situation, which they're very analytical, and sometimes they can use that for good, and where they pick up on things that are maybe something's off about this person. Or they can use it for fun, or evil, where they're, reading someone for filth. And that's, everyone has fun with a good read. Um, so there are these archetypes within the community, and it's fun to think about which ones you want to play, and also which ones you want to play in different contexts, in different social groupings, in different environments, and just at different times of your life. Because there are definitely times where I'm all about the read, and being able to read has helped me immensely in my work. But who I want to be is just more of the, I want to be a Yangus. I think everyone wants to be a Yangus, where at some point where it's like, I just really like you, and I'm going to make sure you're okay. Which that is also something that I believe queer people usually score very highly in the percentiles of like caring for other people. They usually have higher levels of empathy and desire to help other people, which I think is something that is beautiful to highlight and celebrate, because we do need to take care of each other, especially in these times. We do need to be there for one another, and we do need to have loyalty for our friends and the people who stand by us, who help us out. And I think it's a great thing to be able to just represent such a positive friendship and positive connections within our community as well.
I think that's a great answer. I've never, yeah, I don't think I've ever, yeah, I'm trying to think of times when I was playing video games where I thought about this is the kind of person I want to be, not just this is helping me explore my gender. Like I said, I think the farthest that's come to me is that it's reframed my interest, and sometimes what I would describe as an obsession with video games, as something that's healthier, as something that's like that I'm taking ownership of. But I've never played a video game and seen a character and thought I want to be just like her. I've more been thinking like I'm jealous of her experience, but I've never framed it that way for myself. So now I almost, in the future, I'm gonna have to do another episode where I talk about that, because I'm gonna have to like reflect on that. Unless I can somehow percolate before the end of this podcast recording about that. But like you mentioned, games where that have nothing to do with queerness, and we kind of like project ourselves onto it. Like I've played a lot of Pokemon games, and in those games you can play as a girl, and that's like the time I've most projected my queerness onto a video game. And I guess in that sense, Pokemon games have kind of influenced me on who I want to be, because it's made me feel the desire to explore, to discover, to support, and to bond with people, I guess, because those are some of the themes that Pokemon brings. But while you're playing, you definitely have to bring that element to your play style, because even though the game kind of guides you in that direction, you can just be a brute force in these games, and you can pick one powerful Pokemon and you can destroy your enemies along the way. And again, there's not a lot of elbow space in Pokemon to do one or the other, but you can definitely bring certain elements to your play style and then therefore your takeaway from the game is that like, yeah, I just want to be a powerful person. I want to go destroy the Elite Four, and I want to be the best of them all. And for a time, I think I did want to be quote unquote the best, but what does that really mean? Even the Pokemon series could not answer that question when they ended Ash's story. What does being the best really mean? And I do like the conclusion that they came to in the anime, is that like being the best is like making friends, helping people. And I think really that's why I started this podcast too, is like I just wanted to be one positive voice in the queer community. I wanted to be a positive voice to hopefully show the world that queer people are not anything threatening or horrible, but also to tell other queer people that like we're here, we're out here with interests and hobbies, and here's a safe space where you can come weekly and listen to a story or an opinion or some news that has to do with your experience, or at least one part of the queer community's experience, because there's so many very different experiences, despite what role you might play. So I guess my response to your game was another game in itself. So I will ask you what your next game is.
So this one is where we get a little dark turn, because this game came out around the time that had just recently really reaffirmed my closetness. And when I first played it, I hated this game. Like I really wanted to like it. And once again, Final Fantasy 13 is this game, because 13 is the game that the first time I played it, I was like, this game is shit. Like compared to the previous installments in the franchise I played, it just was such a narrow world. And that's not to say not developed, because I was always aware that it was a very deep and rich world, and it was so deep and rich that they made at least 3 games within the same section of this even arc, the Fabula Nova Crystallis world of Final Fantasy. And there's another game that even is in the same universe, but not the same world as 13. But you still have Lassie and people turning to crystal and all that jazz. And that's Final Fantasy Type Zero, which was a very dark and grim game. But that's a story for another day. Final Fantasy 13, its story is very narrow, and a lot of people criticize it for being a hallway simulator. And so you're always just being pushed along a path. And that's because the characters themselves are being pushed along a path that they have no control over. Beings larger than themselves have put their destiny in motion, and they feel like they're puppets on a string. So while the game is an analysis of fighting fate, and that's literally one of my favorite boss tracks in the entire game, it's literally called Fighting Fate. And the path you're kind of put on, whether you choose it or not, this kind of was difficult for me to play at the time, especially because I felt like had to be in the closet for security and safety. And if I came out, then I would be ridiculed. I would be a target. So I wanted nothing more, much like some of the characters, to just go back to my old life, just go back. But, the awareness was awakening in me. And at the same time, there are 2 characters in Final Fantasy 13 who to me, are very clearly lesbians, Fang and Vanille. They have a connection that initially is like, oh, they're just really good friends. And they were roommates. Fang and Vanille would be the kind who in like Victorian England would be like writing letters to one another, and they never married, and they lived together in a cottage, and they had cats together. Like, this would be them. They are so close. And to me, again, it's never outright spoken, but to me, I'm like, yeah, that's a queer relationship. And it was just, yep, exactly. And my dumb brain at the time was like, well, I can't have that. Other people can have that, but I can't have that. I'm too busy trying to just maintain normality. And I think that what kind of agitated me about playing this game was this idea that I know who I am. I know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to resist it. I'm trying to fight fate, if you will. And the game was being like, well, it doesn't matter, the road, it doesn't matter what path you take. You're going towards that end goal eventually. And I was just kind of digging my heels and desperately trying to maintain, being like, but if I come out, then all, like, my world changes. And the level of heightened emotion I was at was, if I come out, my world is over. And it's also ironic that this game is generally about, destroying the world. That's the big bag's plan, is to destroy Cocoon. So in this game, where themes are destruction, rebirth, reimagining, and also interpretation, because the thing the game ultimately tells you, and this is something I didn't realize until I beat it years later, was that even within a path that seems prescribed, you can still find interpretation, and you can still find ways of making it your own.
So knowing that you felt that way, knowing that you felt that way, when you finally did come out, did you go back to that game, or even if you didn't play it, did you like reinterpret it, or did you obviously you're saying now that you realized your interpretation of it was one way, and you had that reflection, but you've also spoke very highly of that game in the past too, at least with me personally. So I'm curious if you ever did revisit it in any way to kind of reanalyze your feelings on that path you're being forced down.
I haven't really had an opportunity to go back and replay it, and I would love to replay it because, honestly, I'd just be better at it. The battle system was so weird that it took me like half the game to even figure it the fuck out, so, and like really make the most of it. And so I'm like, I feel like I just do it better this time. But I haven't really found a way of reliably replaying, but I'm looking for it. I think it might be available on like PlayStation Plus for streaming or something like that. But I'm always wary of streaming games because I've heard there's sometimes issues with performance, and so I'm just generally like, how good's your Wi-Fi? Do you want to play this game? Well, how good is your Wi-Fi? That's the real question. How many people in your household are using the Wi-Fi right now? Oh, someone sucks to suck. And I think that revisiting it, I look back on it with much kinder eyes, because a lot of people, they like to criticize Final Fantasy 13 as being too linear, which my biggest criticism of people who shit on linear storytelling in favor of non-linear is, if you're telling a story, there's always going to be plot progressions. That's kind of the point. It doesn't matter if you're playing an open sandbox game like Infamous or Breath of the Wild or anything like that. Yes, you can do anything and go anywhere, but generally you're still going to fight Calamity again, and you're still going to end up at this point. And Breath of the Wild is a little bit more non-linear and a little bit more open-ended in terms of what you're doing. But most of these games that people are like, oh my God, it's so non-linear. We're like Infamous. It's like you're still going to the same map point to start the mission. You're still doing the missions in the same order. So therefore, it's only the illusion of non-linear play. Final Fantasy 13, because these characters are being forced along, it feels very tight and constricted. And the reason why I look back on it with fonder eyes is because I'm aware of just how brilliant the writing is, because they make the player feel the same level of anxious stress that all the characters are feeling, because they've been forced on a path that they did not choose, that they did not want. And in the world that they're, oh, this is just hitting me now. In the world that they exist in, anyone who is l'Cie, so anyone who has magic, is regarded as monsters. They are here to destroy you. They are here to threaten your children. They are here to threaten your way of life, your society. They are evil. They must be purged. Does this sound familiar? And Primarch Diasley, the leader of Cocoon, very much fuels that fear. And what's funny is it's discovered that he himself is not all he appears to be. And I think I'm just going to spoil it because the game came out in 2009. If you haven't played it now, like...
Yeah, just skip ahead 2 minutes in the podcast if you are trying to avoid spoilers.
Literally, Primarch Diasley, when there's a moment that literally my jaw hit the floor once he used magic, and I'm like, oh my God, the one who's been vilifying magic the entire game also has magic. Again,
Wow.
is this sounding familiar to anyone? And he has a wonderful line that this was in the promo trailer. This was in, a lot of the early footage that we saw when it was being released. He's like, humans are tools. Primarch Diasley is not human. He is a fal'Cie who is very much pulling the strings of this. He is the big bad. And so he's just always manipulating. And he's like, humans are tools. And they're so easy to manipulate. You saw them, a mindless mob drunk on fear of a few l'Cie. Like, that's so easy to control. And he's aware of what games he's playing. And he's aware that with one tweet, he can cause irreparable damage. He's aware that one announcement is all it takes to cause the entire, like, multi-billion person population of Cocoon to turn against these 6 individuals and to defend their way of life, because he's also created this world, because in this world there's Cocoon, which is where most of the population lives, and there's Pulse, which is the planet down below. And there's a massive fear of Grand Pulse, of the planet, where it's like, it's a wild place. They're trying to wipe out our way of life. So it creates an us versus them. And if that ain't straight culture, I don't know what is. The world of Cocoon and Pulse creates this very us and them mentality, this kind of idea that we're good because we're up here and they're trying to destroy our way of life. The other is what to fear. And so the game kind of brings these 6 characters into discovering, you know what, we're still who we are. We can still make choices as we are, and we are not what society tells us we are.
I really like that. And I like that you just had that discovery while we were recording. It sounds very much like a relevant story to today. I mean, even going to see, this is a movie, but like going to see Wicked, which came out as a play 20 years ago, and it was written before that. It's really about the same thing that is happening now, that happened in the 1930s in Europe. That like there's an us versus them mentality, and like one simple, you even like kind of spilled a little bit and said tweet, like one tweet, and suddenly, an entire population has been vilified by an even larger population. It really is that easy. And I like the line about like the population is easy to control because you just have to just touch on that fear just a little bit to get them to do your bidding. And that feels very relevant to today, because it's very easy to say, oh yeah, the trans people are so bad, and they're going after the children, and they're going into the bathrooms, and they're raping, and then they're going into women's prisons, and they're raping there. Ignoring the fact that there's no truth to that. You just have to prey on that little bit of fear. And that this queerness, this otherness, is represented through a handful of magic users. And obviously that's the party, like that's the main storyline. But you could even see in a game with, like, let's say the small population was magic users. These magic users being gay people, queer people. So I think that's really interesting. And actually, I've been putting off Final Fantasy 13 for many years, and I think that might just be, that analysis of it might just be, even though you've just spoiled the ending for me, that actually made me really want to go back and actually finish the game for once. Because it's that linearity that actually bothered me as well. It's that, like, the fact that, like, the story is so hard to comprehend at first. But now that's just like the little push I need, I think.
And I think also what I was bothered with is because normally in any RPG, you start with like a single person, and then you gain maybe one other companion. But for a while, like, your party is usually between 3 and 4 people, depending on which game. And until you get a full party, it's a much harder game. Like, it's a struggle, and it's a slog. And I try and get to the point where the party is complete. With Final Fantasy 13, for most of the game, you are in 2-person parties where the party is divided, and they're all kind of going on their own path that ultimately all weave together. And it really creates a sense of, I felt lost. I'm like, I want everyone together. I want to bring the party together, because once they have a complete party, to me, that's when the game begins. But it really also, that's a metaphor for, queer people finding each other and finding those people that you can journey with. And I think it's also a very telling little metaphor that the person who is controlling the narrative also happens to have magic. And ain't that a fun little commentary on the very people who are presenting so many aggressive bills against queer people are also caught in, same-sex scandals, whether it's, being caught with sex workers or going to strip clubs, or, having pasts that are a little like, ooh, that person might be a little fruity. And it's like, and first of all, so fucking what? If they're like, listen, I don't shade any of that behavior. It's a little ironic that you're trying to take away the rights of people. Meanwhile, you are partaking in sex activities that you are trying to vilify. Like, that's a little, that's the funny part. And by funny, I mean actively harmful to people.
Yeah.
But that's why this game is, to me, one of the best of the franchise, because it hits so much things, so many themes of oppression and manipulation, but also, again, despite this system that's very constricting, you find a way to choose your own fate and decide how your fate plays out, rather than just listening to the narrative. Because honestly, if I was just listening to the narratives that were told to me when I was in the closet and scared for my life to come out, I would believe that there are 2 ways that I could end up being queer, which one was dying of AIDS, and one was being forever resentful of myself and wistfully longing for days that will never happen and happiness that will never happen. Because those are most of the queer narratives that I was exposed to when I was younger. That was the story around being queer. And we're so lucky we have so many more stories now that tells moments of queer joy and moments of, that it's okay, you will get through it. But again, I'll bring Wicked into it just briefly to end up. Nothing brings people together like a really good enemy.
It's true. And right now, queer people are ever the enemy. And we've seen this before. It's very important right now to build community and find each other, and again, finding these little moments of escapism in the stories we watch, in the games we play, in the books we read. It's harder to find those stories in AAA games. We know that Dragon Age came out last year, Life is Strange Double Exposure came out last year, and those are like the 2 big AAA games that have queer stories in them. But again, and this podcast is hell-bent on finding more queer indie games that have these stories, that have that representation, or at least have those themes, so people can resonate with something in them. So I think I will quickly go through the last game on my list, which is, and I know at the start I said I had 3 games. I had 3 games during the pandemic, but the 4th one was Pokemon, which I've talked about. But the last game that I played right before my egg cracked was Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. And you're probably thinking, Zoe, what? And on one hand, you're right, but Uncharted: The Lost Legacy was, first off, Uncharted is one of my favorite game series, regardless of the genders represented in the story. It's just a really good feeling of adventure, a really good sense of exploration, and I like history. I like discovering history, discovering details, discovering stories, and Uncharted is like the fun parts of that, right? It's the the exciting, the action. Oh, you're fighting Nazis, you're fighting bad guys to find the truth, which is something I feel like I'm constantly doing in my own world. Not even just on the podcast, but just fighting for my own truth. But Uncharted: The Lost Legacy was really exciting to me because it was basically an extension of Uncharted 4, which is one of the best Uncharted games in the series. But not only that, but it has not one but 2 female protagonists that are already present in the other games. They're already really cool characters that are well written, but it's a game just about them, and they don't really like each other that much either. It's not a game really about girl power, even though it is. The story doesn't start off with like, oh, we're 2 women who should team up, let's team up. It's more like their paths are crossed and they're forced to team up out of nothing other than the necessity to. And so playing this game,
unadulterated loathing for your face, your voice, your clothing. Continue, sorry.
No, it's good. We should have more musical numbers on the show. It would be great.
Absolutely.
But so playing this game, though, it was just really nice to see 2 well-written female characters in this narrative that was very much a testosterone-driven story. And just to see them to play as these characters and basically do all the same things you do in the Uncharted games as a woman. So there was nothing really queer about it, I think, at all. But to again, I don't think Nathan Drake and Elena are even in the game. Sam is, I think, so Nathan Drake's brother. But for the most part, all these prominent characters are sidelined for these 2 women who have been in the past villains and side characters that don't really get enough attention in a positive light in the story. So it was just nice to be able to play an Uncharted game that is, again, normally very testosterone heavy with 2 women. So I'm just getting in the weeds here, but that was very exciting to me, was just to like forget gender. But like my favorite thing about women and women-led stories is like when women are doing things that are usually done by men, or at least not usually, but prominently done by men. I think women can do anything that man can do for the most part, but it was always very liberating for me to see women do things that are normally in activities dominated by men, is what I'm trying to say. And Uncharted: The Lost Legacy was like the pinnacle of that for me, especially since it was like right before my egg cracked. So
therefore it has a kind of lasting resonance as well, because it punctuates a kind of end period. And also I think it punctuates a kind of end for the franchise as well, where, whatever they continue with after that point, that kind of wraps up the journey we've been on with Nathan Drake and these characters. So if there's more Uncharted in the future, which, I think that Uncharted is a great franchise because it brings that kind of Indiana Jones style of puzzling and discovering like ancient, old, forgotten places, and also adding all that action in as well. Like, they're beautiful games. They're not for me. I suck at puzzles. I really, again, I'm an RPG person. I need to be able to steamroll over my problems. And I don't play video games to think as much as I have just thought a lot about video games. I'm there for the characters in the story more than the challenging gameplay. It's why I've never finished a Legend of Zelda game, because puzzles and I don't get along.
Yeah, when I was younger, I didn't like puzzles either, but transitioning again gave me this reaffirmed motivation to go back into things that I felt I was interested in, that I maybe didn't enjoy the first time for one reason or another. And I've discovered a lot more gameplay styles and genres that I would like. I've also discovered things like, okay, I definitely don't like this kind of game, but I definitely like this kind of game. So yeah, it's just like video games have just been very liberating for me in general, especially too in high school when I really went deep into the closet. Like I was like in grade 6, I grew my hair out because my mom said when I was really little, like still in a stroller, my mom said my hair was growing out. I hadn't ever cut it. My mom had never cut it before. And people would walk by me and think I was a girl in the stroller, and my mom would correct them. But hearing that in my 11-year-old brain, something clicked, and I was like, oh, they thought I was a girl with long hair. It's okay for quote unquote boys to grow their hair out. So I tried growing my hair out in grade 6, and I was mocked relentlessly. Um, and so at the end, I was very stubborn. I was like, I'm not giving in to the bullies. So I kept my hair long until the last day of grade 6. And then at the end of that day, I literally said, Mom, we need to go to the hairdresser. I need a haircut. And I got a haircut. Now, I was honestly not, I don't know if it was because I was sad about my long hair going away, but it was also the worst masculine haircut I'd ever had, I felt. So, but anyway, that preluded high school. So it was the next few years, grade 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, where I just went deep into the closet. I was like, okay, I got relentlessly bullying for even like sticking my toe out of the closet to try being a girl. So I'm never going to do that again. So also went away was like all my interests and all the stuff I enjoyed as a kid, which was like Pokemon, which was Thomas the Tank Engine, like all my interests. And so also that meant video games too, because video games were for babies at the time. And people were making fun of me for not only did they make fun of my hair, but they made fun of everything else too. So it was like video games. Oh yeah, this person likes Pokemon. Like that's lame too. So it was like, okay, time to, and Pokemon was the main reason I played video games. It was like, I'm buying a Nintendo console for Pokemon. And then, oh, I'm also going to play the new Mario, or I'm also going to play a Zelda game, or I'm going to play. And so the last time I bought a console was the Wii. And the only time I went and played a video game at all in high school, actually the 2 times, was you were talking about Final Fantasy 13 at the time. So I was very interested in it. I tried playing it, and it was like an RPG that was too different from Pokemon, so it didn't stick. But they remade Heart Gold, and I'm so glad my nostalgia won over my, quote unquote, in the closetness for both my transness and my love of video games. But I went and bought Pokemon Heart Gold, and thankfully I did, because that game is so expensive on the I almost said black market, but like on eBay, if you want to go buy a copy of that game, it's like $300-400 just for the case. So
Well, like I'm sure that there are some people on, these underground marketplaces who are like, how much do you want Pokemon Heart Gold? I can provide for you, but it will cost you. Because I know especially that iteration of Gen 2 is very expensive now. Like that, like Heart Gold and Soul Silver, I think really, like they're very pricey to find in any like used game shop I've seen. If I've seen a copy, if it's usually been several hundreds of dollars at least.
But yeah, I'm glad I picked it up too, because also Pokemon Crystal, which the game is ultimately a remake of Crystal as well, was the first time I got to play as a girl in the game. So I think that part of me was almost using that game as a way to try to get out of the closet again. Ultimately, I didn't even finish the game. I played as a boy. I didn't name myself after my dead name. I did name myself after the character. I was like, I'm not projecting myself onto this character. I'm going to role play as the character if he was in the anime. I never picked, and also they changed the girl character from Crystal to a different character, and I was like, that's not me. That's not who I played as. Like, it was almost like my avatar had been taken away as well. But those were the only times in high school where I kind of stuck my neck out of the closet to play video games. And again, I have a deep connection with my transness, my queerness, and video games. Even if they're not inherently both, they are the same. They're inherently linked together. And so coming out of the closet and being a trans woman now, I feel very liberated and enjoying what I want to enjoy, despite what anyone might say of me, because I put my transness in the closet at the same time I put my interests in the closet, because they were, again, even as a kid, very heavily linked. So anyway, that's a very long tangent,
but I think I'll hop on the end of that and just say that I think it's very interesting that part of the closet is this restriction of personal enjoyment and hobbies and things that you derive pleasure from. But something I remember about being in the closet was I was afraid to be too impassioned about anything, because I was afraid that if I was too excited, I would get a little too much myself. And if I was too much myself, people would know, wait a minute, that person's gay as fuck.
Yep. Oh, 100%.
That was always a big fear. And, given that we were both interacting within the like straight male sphere of, straight men have a like no fault system. If you're even suspected to be even a little bit fruity, that will always haunt your reputation. So there is this no fault system of, there is no room for insubordination. There's no room for infractions. And I'm putting air quotes around all of these. This is incredible sarcasm. Even though it doesn't sound like it, my delivery is so good. Oh my God. But it is really interesting that one of the things you restricted was narrative. And I also played the female character when I played Pokemon Crystal. That was my first Pokemon game, and I have a very like fondness for Crystal because the next Pokemon game I played was Shield. Like I took a break. It's not that I didn't enjoy it; it's just I never had Nintendo systems. I was a Sony. I had my PlayStation, 2, 3, and 4. So that's where I focused my video game efforts, and I never restricted video games. I mean, I didn't necessarily make it part of my personality, and like I didn't announce that I played them. I wasn't, ashamed of it, but I just kind of was like, oh, but like I just play, RPGs, like that's all. But clearly, even RPGs that have, I don't think any of the games I've talked about today have anything to do with queerness directly. But they have that resonance anyways, because narratives are not about one thing. Just because something thematically is depicting oppression that is like, you can see a film or you can see a video game that it talks about oppression, and it's like clearly it's supposed to be a metaphor for, let's say, racial prejudice. Prejudice is prejudice and can be interpreted a number of ways. And for queer people, we can also see that prejudice play out in a lot of similar ways and different ways as well. And we can see ourselves in narratives even if we are not directly there. But I think what's important to note is that we've always been there. We always will be there. And it doesn't matter what people say, whether we are being pushed to the background or not. That is not the truth of queerness. Queerness is about enduring. Queerness, queer people have always found a way to get by. We've usually been regulated to the outskirts of society. We are a counterculture to the heteronormative societies that most people live in around the world. There is usually a constant threat of oppression, of our rights being taken away, of I just heard that like a bill just passed where businesses can now refuse service due to queerness in the US, which is incredibly disheartening. That's a groundbreaking, if not horrifying, law to pass.
Remember, everyone, this is not any specific call to action, but just keep in mind that for any listeners wondering, Pride was originally a protest.
And I think that, again, what's interesting is that when both of us were in the closet, there was almost this focus on like, the stories we consume are important, and the stories we tell are important. We both told stories, presented ourselves in certain ways to tell a narrative, and now we tell a different narrative. And to all you dear listeners out there, never forget that it's never too late to change your narrative.
Ever. Hopefully for the better, too.
Always for the better.
So we've been going on a while, Graeme. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I wanted to know if there were any other games you wanted to talk about briefly before we head out.
I don't think so. I think I'd sound like a broken record at this point. Yeah, no, I think that I've said my bit.
I have also said my bit. So I think we will head out here, but I want to thank you so much for joining me again this week. It's always such a pleasure to have you on. I've been trying to get you back on the show for the last couple months. Graeme was supposed to join us for the end of the year podcast we recorded, although given that all of us talk a long time and Graeme also talks a long time, those podcasts would have been hours long. We did joke later after recording those, like it was kind of good that Graeme couldn't show up, even though it was because you were sick, unfortunately. But it was a bit of a blessing in disguise because we were trying to stick to a time schedule there and we just would not have made it.
No, you definitely would not have made that, because someone would say something, I'd be like, so I actually have a point on that. Like, I actually can, I'm going to throw my 2 cents in there, and you're like, Grant, you've already given $5. You're fine.
No, I want your $5 and I want your next $5, metaphorically speaking. I don't want your actual money, but I do want your opinions, and I would love to have you on the show again. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me on True Avatars this week. It's been a blast.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that just about wraps up this week's show. Thanks again, True Avatars, for joining me for another episode of your Queer Video Game Podcast. If you've made it this far into the episode, I really appreciate you taking the time to support queer-made content, which is a big deal. If you want to support the show, it would be really great if you could leave a rating, review, or comment on your preferred podcast platform. Please check out the website trueavatarspodcast.com, all one word, that's trueavatarspodcast.com. You can also find the show on Facebook and Instagram under True Avatars. You can also find it on Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube under the handle @TrueAvatars, all one word. Importantly, if you or anyone you know is queer and involved with video games in some way, please don't be shy. I would love to hear from more queer voices in video games. Your voice is unique and valid and worth sharing with the world. And if you don't want to be on the show or know anyone who's interested, but you know about a cool queer video game or games industry story that's queer related, please let me know. The show's official email is trueavatars.podcast@gmail.com. That's trueavatars.podcast@gmail.com. You can also feel free to reach out via the website or the aforementioned social media pages. Things are tough out there, and queer people need to stick together when we can. Bye, True Avatars. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to speaking with you all again next week. Take care and stay safe.